The first time someone laughed at the tunnel was one autumn morning, when the excavation was still just an uneven hole beside the house. A neighbor drove by in his pickup truck, slowed down, and shouted something about digging his own grave ahead of time. The young woman didn't respond. He continued shoveling earth, his arm muscles burning, cold sweat clinging to his shirt, even with the icy north wind blowing. That wouldn't be the last comment. In the following days, the joke spread through the community like wildfire. Older farmers shook their heads as they drove down the dirt road, muttering about wasted energy and the paranoia of those who had never faced a real winter. She knew what they were saying, because some didn't bother to lower their voices. The paradox was simple and brutal. The harder she worked, the more ridiculous she seemed. The more she prepared, the weaker she was considered. The community's logic was clear. Anyone who needed an underground tunnel to reach their barn didn't have the necessary fiber to survive in that land. The winters had always been harsh, the blizzards always terrible, and no one had ever needed to hide underground to feed the animals. Tradition worked because it had always worked. Questioning it wasn't just strange, it was almost an offense. And she, too young, too quiet, too different, had no right to suggest that perhaps there was another way, but there was something they didn't see. While they laughed, she studied. While they mocked, she measured. And while they repeated that it had always been this way, she knew that not everything that had always been would continue to be. The tunnel wasn't fear. It was reading signs that others chose to ignore. It was preparation for something that didn't yet have a name, but that already whispered in the cold wind that arrived earlier each year. And when that something truly arrived, the laughter would freeze before the words. The property lay at the end of a secondary road where the asphalt had given way miles before, replaced by dirt tracks riddled with frozen ruts. The house was small, made of dark wood stained by time, with narrow windows that trembled when the wind blew strongly. The barn was about 30 meters away, a more solid structure than the house itself, with a sloping roof and reinforced walls to withstand the weight of the snow. Between the two lay an open field, covered in dry grass that crackled under boots. On the horizon, only empty fields, crooked fences, and the distant outline of grey mountains. The silence there was not peace. It was absence of voices, of movement, of anything that would remind one that the world continued to exist beyond that line where the sky merged with the frozen earth. She had inherited all of that 3 months earlier, after her mother died without warning or farewell. There was no grand wake, just a few people at the church, pitying glances that she dismissed with a nod. The community expected her to sell the property, return to the city she had come from years ago, give up what she clearly wasn't ready to carry. But she stayed. Not out of stubbornness, not out of pride. She stayed because the animals needed her, because abandoning that place would be admitting that her mother had been wrong to try to put down roots there, and because, deep down, she had nowhere else to go. The loneliness wasn't new. It had just gained a fixed address. Her nearest neighbours lived almost 2 kilometers away. They were practical people, of few words and many certainties. Men who repaired tractors with wire and faith. Women who guarded their canning recipes like state secrets. They looked at her and saw someone out of place. Too young to have real responsibility. Too educated to get her hands truly dirty. Too quiet to inspire trust. She didn't attend church meetings, didn't ask for advice, didn't complain. This made her strange, and what is strange in that kind of place is rarely welcome. The difference doesn't need to be great to create distance. It's enough not to fit into the collective rhythm, not to repeat the same phrases, not to accept the same truths without questioning. Inside the barn, the smell of damp hay mixed with manure formed a dense layer in the air. 6 cows, some chickens, 2 pigs, and an old goat that the mother insisted on keeping alive out of sheer sentimental stubbornness. The animals were the only source of income. Milk, eggs, meat occasionally. Without them, the property was worthless. And without her, the animals would die in days. It was a mutual dependence, silent and absolute. She knew the sound of each animal, knew when something was wrong just by the rhythm of their breathing or the way they moved. They didn't judge her. They didn't laugh. They didn't expect her to be different from what she was. And perhaps that's why caring for them was the only thing that still made sense. The isolation wasn't just geographical. It was emotional, structural, inevitable. Every time she went to town to buy feed or tools, she felt the weight of the stairs, the conversations that died when she entered the store, the polite smiles that didn't reach her eyes, the constant feeling of being measured, evaluated, considered insufficient. She didn't try to change it. She didn't force friendliness. She didn't feign intimacy. She simply bought what she needed, thanked with a nod, and returned to the empty road. Loneliness, when chosen, is bearable. When imposed, it weighs differently, but it weighs the same. The idea for the tunnel didn't come from a book or a sudden revelation. It came from observation. She spent hours studying old climate records kept in the municipal library, yellowed pages that no one consulted anymore. The winters were changing. Not obviously, not from one year to the next, but in a slow and undeniable progression. Minimum temperatures were falling further, storms were lasting longer, and the intervals between snowstorms were decreasing. There were reports of farmers who froze to death just meters from their own homes, unable to find their way back in the blinding snow. She noted dates, compared patterns, drew graphs in old notebooks. And then she made the decision. If the winter was becoming more deadly, she needed a way to reach the animals without exposing herself. An underground tunnel was the only logical solution. When she first mentioned the idea, it was at the agricultural cooperative, while waiting in line to pay for bags of feed. A man with a grey beard and enormous hands overheard and let out a loud laugh, the kind that makes your chest tremble. He repeated the idea aloud to the others, as if it were a ready-made joke. A tunnel. To go from the house to the barn, like a coal mine or a war shelter. The entire line turned to look. Some laughed openly. Others just shook their heads with that expression of pity mixed with contempt. No one asked why. No one wanted to know the reasons. The idea in itself was absurd enough to be discarded. She paid in silence and left carrying the heavy bags on her shoulders, feeling the laughter still echoing behind her. In the following days, the news spread. Not as news, but as a joke. The young woman from the property at the end of the road was digging a tunnel because she was afraid of snow. Some said it was something city people did, that they never understood how rural life really works. Others suggested she was losing her mind after her mother's death, that grief had clouded her judgment. There were also those who thought it was arrogance, an attempt to prove she knew more than entire generations of farmers who had survived without needing tricks. The tunnel became a symbol of weakness, of exaggeration, of disconnection from reality. And she, by extension, became a walking joke. The risk, according to everyone, was obvious. Digging a long hole underground without professional equipment was asking to be buried alive. The wood she was using to reinforce the walls was old, salvaged from broken fences and loose planks from the barn. The thermal insulation she was trying to improvise with compacted straw and plastic sheeting was considered pathetic. And even if the tunnel didn't collapse, it would be useless. No one had ever needed it. The winters had always been brutal, and people had always found ways to survive. Crossing the open terrain was part of the routine, part of the test that separated those who belonged to that land from those who merely passed through it. To surrender to fear was to surrender to defeat, but she didn't stop. Every ironic comment, every disdainful glance, every disguised laugh only reinforced the certainty that she was alone in this. And perhaps that was exactly why she needed to continue. Not to prove anything to anyone, but because she knew that when the real winter arrived, opinions wouldn't matter. Preparation would matter. Structure would matter. And the difference between having a protected path and not having one could be the difference between life and death. So she kept digging, kept reinforcing, kept being ridiculed, because preparation never asks permission to appear sensible. The work always began at dusk, when the chances of being seen diminished. Daylight exposed her too much, inviting stares and fueling comments. At night, only the wind and the cold were witnesses. She lit a kerosene lantern at the entrance of the hole and descended with the shovel, her whole body tense with the expectation that the earth might give way at any moment. The ground was hard, compacted by decades of frost and thaw. Each stroke of the shovel removed only a few centimeters of progress. Her hands formed blisters that burst and created new calluses. Her back ached constantly, a pain she had learned to ignore. The sweat cooled too quickly on her skin, creating that damp, penetrating sensation that not even the thickest clothes could block. But she continued, centimeter by centimeter, night after night. The depth was carefully calculated. It couldn't be too shallow, because the cold would penetrate the earthen walls and make the tunnel as icy as the outside. It couldn't be too deep, because that would increase the risk of collapse and hinder ventilation. She chose 1.5 meters below the surface, enough for the earth to act as natural insulation. The width was just right, only enough for a person to pass through bent over carrying a bucket. There was no room for comfort, only for function. Every meter excavated was immediately reinforced. Old, but still solid, wooden beams were positioned vertically on each side. Horizontal planks formed the walls, carefully nailed to avoid gaps that were too large. The roof received special treatment, with double layers of wood and stakes driven into the earth above to distribute the weight. Thermal insulation was the most delicate part. She didn't have money for modern materials, so she improvised with what she could find. Dry straw was compacted between the boards and the earth on the sides, creating an air barrier that reduced the transfer of cold. Pieces of thick plastic sheeting, remnants of an old barn roof, were stretched and fixed to the interior walls to block moisture. She knew that moisture was a silent enemy. Any condensation would turn to ice, and ice could crack the wood, weaken the structure, and render the tunnel unusable. Therefore, small openings were left in the ceiling every 3 meters. Improvised PVC pipes served as ventilation chimneys, allowing air to circulate without creating overly strong drafts. Each pipe was protected on the surface with a slanted cap to prevent direct snow from entering. The floor received special attention. She didn't dig it completely flat. She created a subtle, almost imperceptible slope that directed any meltwater to a small drain dug next to the main entrance. This way, even if snow entered while the doors were open or if moisture accumulated, the liquid wouldn't form puddles that would freeze and make the floor slippery and dangerous. On top of the compacted earth, she placed spaced wooden planks, creating a kind of raised floor that kept feet away from direct contact with the icy ground. Walking inside would be uncomfortable, but it would be possible. And possible was all she needed. The doors were the most critical element. She built 2 at each end, separated by a small intermediate space. The idea was simple, but effective. Never open both doors at the same time. The first door would block the outside wind. The person would enter, close it behind them, and only then open the second door to access the interior of the house or barn. This intermediate space acted as an air chamber, preventing icy gusts from directly invading the tunnel or the heated rooms. The doors were heavy, made of thick planks reinforced with metal hinges. She tested each one several times, opening and closing them, checking that the fit was firm enough to block the wind, but not so tight that it would freeze and become impossible to open. The tunnel entrance in the house was in the corner of the kitchen, under an old table that she moved aside to open the trap door. The exit in the barn was positioned exactly next to the compartment where the feed and water buckets were kept. It wasn't by chance. Every step mattered. The less time exposed to the cold inside the barn, the better. She measured the distance several times, adjusting the angle of the excavation to ensure the tunnel ended at the exact spot. Precision wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. Every extra meter of walking inside an unheated environment could make a difference when the temperature was below anything bearable. For weeks, she worked alone. No one offered help. No one asked if I needed anything. Sometimes she would spend the entire day without uttering a single word. The only sounds were the shovel hitting the ground, the creaking of the wood being adjusted, the wind howling outside as a warning of what was to come. Her back ached so much that lying in bed became torture. The muscles in her arms trembled with exhaustion, but each night that ended with another meter of tunnel completed was a small victory against fear, against judgment, against the collective certainty that it made no sense. She devised a system for transporting the excavated earth. Old buckets, loaded one at a time, dumped far from the entrance so as not to arouse suspicion or create visible mounds that would attract more comments. The work was slow, repetitive, and solitary. But there was something comforting about the routine. Every gesture had a purpose. Every decision had a direct consequence. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. Either the tunnel would work, or she would have wasted months of work, but at least she would have tried. And trying in that context was already a form of resistance. Perhaps you're watching this story and recognize this kind of loneliness. Subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Stories like this need to be shared. Autumn ended earlier than expected. The first frosts arrived in October, covering the grass with a white crust that crackled under boots. The sky took on that permanent grey hue, unchanging, with no promise of sunshine. The wind changed direction, now coming directly from the north, sharp as a blade, carrying with it the metallic smell of distant snow. She watched the low clouds gathering on the horizon and felt something change in the air. It wasn't just cold, it was weight, a different, dense atmospheric pressure, as if the world were holding its breath before releasing something inevitable. The animals felt it too. The cows became restless, mooing for no apparent reason. The chickens went to roost earlier. Even the old goat, normally stubborn, sought shelter without resisting. The first snowfall was brief but intense. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon without much ceremony. Within hours, the ground between the house and the barn disappeared under a layer of 15 centimeters of snow. It was nothing the local farmers hadn't seen before. They continued their routines as usual, braving the cold in thick coats and hats pulled up to their eyebrows. But she noticed something different. The snow didn't melt in the following days. Normally, even after heavy snowfalls, the sun would appear for a few hours and reduce the layer. This time, it didn't. The sky remained overcast, the temperature didn't rise, and the snow compacted, turning into a hard crust that reflected the little light available with a blinding and aggressive glare. The wind began to blow more frequently, not occasional gusts, but a steady stream that swept across the snow's surface, creating small, ghostly swirls. She knew what that meant. Constant wind prevented the snow from settling evenly. It created unpredictable accumulations, high mounds in some places and exposed surfaces in others. Walking in these conditions was risky. One step could sink to her knee, the next find solid ground. The instability was dangerous, especially carrying heavy buckets or trying to maintain balance against gusts that pushed her body sideways. She tested the tunnel for the first time that week. She descended through the trapdoor in the kitchen, walked down the narrow corridor bent over, and climbed into the barn. It worked perfectly. No wind, no snow, just the muffled silence of the surrounding earth. The neighbors weren't worried yet. For them, it was just the normal start of another winter. Difficult, yes, but manageable. Some commented on the early snow, but always with the certainty of those who had already lived through dozens of similar seasons. Their confidence came from experience, from repetition, from the belief that the past was a reliable model for the future. They didn't notice the small signs she mentally catalogued. The way the ice formed thicker on the edges of the roofs, the speed at which the water pipes began to freeze, even with protection, the frequency with which the thermometer registered temperatures that were once rare but were now becoming common. Each piece of data was a part of a puzzle they refused to assemble. Then came the small but persistent problems. A fence broke under the weight of the accumulated snow. A neighbor lost some chickens that escaped from the henhouse and froze before they could be found. Another had difficulty opening the barn door because ice had sealed the cracks overnight. Nothing catastrophic, but inconvenient enough to create a latent unease. Conversations in town began to include comments about the winter being harsher than usual, but still, No one connected this to the need to change anything. The solution was always the same: endure, force, push. Adapting wasn't in their vocabulary. And she, observing everything from afar, knew that enduring had its limits, and that this limit was closer than anyone imagined. The second snowstorm came with a violence no one expected. It began in the early hours of a November morning, with thick, heavy flakes falling in absolute silence. By dawn, the snow layer was already over 40 centimeters thick. But it didn't stop. It continued snowing all day, the entire following night, and part of the morning of the third day. When it finally ceased, the world had disappeared under a white blanket that reached waist height in some places. The wind, which had previously been constant but bearable, now roared like a wounded animal. Violent gusts ripped snow from the surface and threw it into the air, creating opaque curtains that made it impossible to see 5 meters away. Leaving the house became an exercise in immediate survival, no longer an uncomfortable routine. Temperatures plummeted. The thermometer on the porch of the house read 20 degrees below zero during the day, 30 at night. But it wasn't just the temperature, it was the wind chill. The wind transformed each degree below zero into a blade that cut exposed skin in seconds. Breathing hurt. The icy air burned the lungs, forced involuntary coughs, created that sharp pain in the chest that resembled drowning in reverse. Hands, even inside thick gloves, began to lose feeling in minutes. Fingers became stiff, unable to hold anything firmly. Ears burned as if on fire, and the nose ran constantly, the liquid freezing into crystals on the edges of the nostrils. Being outdoors for more than 15 minutes without adequate protection was an invitation to severe frostbite. The farmers tried to maintain their routine. Some managed to reach the barns in the early days, walking bent over against the wind, using ropes tied between the house and the sheds to avoid getting lost in the blinding snow. But each day it became more difficult. The accumulated snow created physical barriers. Walking was like crossing soft sand, each step requiring double the effort, sinking up to the knee, sometimes even the thigh. Carrying buckets of feed or water became an almost impossible task. The weight threw the body off balance, and falling in the snow meant losing precious minutes trying to get up, soaking clothes, increasing the risk of hypothermia. Some began to skip feedings, visiting the animals only once a day instead of twice. Others reduced portions, trying to stretch supplies and minimize the number of trips needed. Then came the structural failures. A barn lost part of its roof under the weight of the snow. The old beams, never designed to withstand that load, gave way with a dry crack that echoed through the neighborhood even through the storm. 3 cows were exposed to the deadly cold. The owner tried to improvise a cover with tarps, but the wind ripped everything away. The animals began to tremble violently, their eyes wide with panic and confusion. Elsewhere, a barn door froze completely. The ice filled the hinges, sealed the gaps, turning the wood and metal into a single, immobile piece. The farmer spent hours trying to force it open, hammering, pouring lukewarm water that froze before making a difference. When he finally managed to open it, the animals inside had been without fresh water for almost 2 days. the electricity began to fail. Poles fell under the weight of ice accumulating on the wires. Transformers exploded with blue flashes that briefly illuminated the white landscape before plunging everything into darkness again. Without electricity, no heaters. Without heaters, the houses cooled quickly. People huddled around fireplaces and wood-burning stoves, burning what they had, rationing fuel because no one knew how long it would last. The tap water froze. Pipes cracked inside the walls, creating damage that would only be discovered later. To get drinking water, it was necessary to melt snow, a slow process that consumed energy and time. For the animals, it meant breaking layers of ice at the watering troughs several times a day, a task that many simply could no longer accomplish. Communication with the city became impossible. The roads were impassable, blocked by mounds of snow that the few available snowplows couldn't overcome. Landline phones didn't work without electricity. Cell phones had weak signal and batteries that drained quickly in the cold. People were isolated, each property becoming a lonely island in a white and hostile ocean. There was no help coming from outside. There was no rescue on the way. Each family, each person, was completely alone to deal with whatever happened. And what was happening was worse than any collective memory could comprehend. The animals began to die. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in a terrible and inevitable progression. First the weakest, the oldest, the newborns who didn't have enough fat to withstand the cold. Then came deaths from dehydration, because the water froze faster than it could be replenished. Some deaths were from starvation, because the owners couldn't reach them often enough. Others were simply from the extreme cold, bodies giving up after days of shivering without stopping, systems collapsing when the internal temperature dropped beyond the point of no return. Every animal lost was money lost, livelihood lost, future lost, and there was nothing that willpower or experience could do against it. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero on a clear morning with a biting wind. The brightness was deceptive, making it seem like the day would be better, but the cold was the worst yet. Going outside for 30 seconds was enough to feel the skin on your face burning. 1 minute, and your fingertips would start to yellow. 5 minutes, and the risk of permanent frostbite became real. Survival was no longer about comfort or routine. It was about immediate decisions, risk it or give up. Try to feed the animals and perhaps die along the way, or stay safe and let them wither away. And at that point, finally, the collective pride began to crack. Because no tradition, no past experience had prepared anyone for that. If you've ever been through something similar, you know that it's moments like these that show who was truly prepared. Leave a like and keep following, because survival stories need to be remembered. The first to knock on the door was a middle-aged man who lived 3 properties south. She knew him by sight. He was one of those who had laughed the loudest when he heard about the tunnel. He arrived at noon, covered in snow up to his shoulders, his face red and swollen with cold, his eyes wide with a mixture of despair and shame. He didn't say much. He only asked in a hoarse, broken voice if it was true that she had a protected path to the barn. She confirmed it. He was silent for a few seconds, looking at his own feet, at the snow piled up on the porch, anywhere but her face. Then he asked if he could use it, not as a favor, not as a right, but as a plea. He said he had lost 2 calves the previous night and could no longer reach the remaining animals without risking his own life. His voice trembled, not just from the cold. She didn't answer immediately. She watched the man standing there, destroyed by a combination of physical exhaustion and emotional collapse. She saw in his features the weight of having mocked something he now begged to use. There was no triumph in that moment, only a silent realization that reality had arrived, brutal and indifferent to everyone's opinions. She nodded and opened the door. He entered slowly, as if he couldn't believe he would be allowed, and climbed down the trapdoor she indicated. A few minutes later, he was on the other side, in the barn, feeding his own animals without having to face the wind that could have killed him. When he returned, he murmured an almost inaudible thank you and left through the same storm that had arrived. But something had changed. The invisible barrier between contempt and recognition had begun to crumble. In the following hours, others came. Not many, not all, but enough to realize that the tunnel was no longer a joke. It was a solution. A young woman with 2 small children asked to fetch hay from the barn without exposing the children to the deadly cold. An elderly couple who no longer had the strength to wade through thigh-deep snow asked for help checking if their goats were still alive. Each visit was marked by the same pattern: awkward silence, a shy request, profound relief at seeing that it worked. No one apologized directly. No one admitted to being wrong. But actions spoke louder than words. They came because they needed to. And she allowed it because she understood that survival has no room for resentment. The shift in the collective gaze was subtle but undeniable. When she went to the city in the brief intervals between storms, the comments had stopped. No one laughed anymore. No one joked about digging her own grave. Instead, there were questions. Technical questions about depth, about structural reinforcement, about thermal insulation, practical questions about how long it had taken, how many people would be needed, whether there would still be time to build something similar before the winter got even worse. The tunnel had ceased to be an eccentricity and had become a model. And she, from an object of mockery, had become a silent reference to something that no one wanted to admit aloud. That preparation was worth more than tradition when reality changed the rules of the game. The final storm arrived without weather warning, because there was no more electricity to power radios or internet to access forecasts. It arrived as a solid wall of wind and snow that turned day into night in a matter of minutes. The roar was deafening, a constant and violent sound that made the walls of the house tremble. Visibility dropped to absolute zero. Opening the front door meant being hit by a gust so strong that it pushed the body backward, ripped the air from the lungs, and threw snow inside as if it were sand hurled by an explosion. The outside thermometer had stopped working at 42 degrees below zero, but the real temperature was certainly worse. The cold was no longer just discomfort or danger. It was a death sentence for anything living exposed to it for more than a few minutes. She was in the kitchen when she heard desperate knocking on the door. Not polite knocking, but heavy, urgent banging, rhythmic with panic. She opened it and found 5 people huddled on the porch, covered in ice from head to toe, trembling violently, their faces so pale they looked like corpses. 2 women, 2 men, and a child of perhaps 8 years old, all from the neighborhood, all with the same story. Inaccessible barns, animals trapped without food for more than a day, failed attempts to reach them that almost resulted in death by freezing. One of the men had blackened fingers, a clear sign of the beginning of necrosis. The child cried silently, tears frozen on her cheeks. They weren't there to ask for a favor. They were there because it was the only chance they had. She didn't hesitate. She organized everything with the efficiency of someone who had planned exactly for that moment. She explained the rules quickly, one person at a time in the tunnel. Carry only the essentials. Always close both doors in sequence to maintain thermal insulation. Don't run, because the floor was uneven, and a fall could mean serious injury, far from any medical help. She divided the tasks. 2 people would feed the animals in alternating shifts. Another would fetch melted water from the barn, where she had improvised a minimal heating system. The others would help organize supplies and control the flow. The child would stay in the house, near the fireplace, warming slowly to avoid thermal shock. Each instruction was clear, direct, with no room for confusion or improvisation. The tunnel was tested to its limits during those hours. People entered and exited in a constant flow, carrying buckets of feed, bales of hay, and containers of water. The narrow corridor, which had previously seemed claustrophobic and unnecessary, now revealed every inch of its purpose. The reinforced wooden walls held firm under the pressure of the frozen earth above. The thermal insulation kept the internal temperature bearable, not hot, but far from the lethal cold that reigned a few meters away. The double doors fulfilled their function perfectly, blocking the wind that howled outside like a beast trying to get in. The slope of the floor directed the little moisture that remained away from the passageways. The ventilation ducts allowed breathing without creating icy drafts. Everything worked exactly as it had been designed. In the barn, the animals were frightened but alive. Access through the tunnel allowed them to be fed and watered without exposing anyone to the mortal danger outside. Each cow, each pig, each chicken represented not just an animal, but the livelihood of an entire family. Losing those animals meant losing the ability to survive economically in the following months. It meant hunger, debt, forced displacement, and at that moment, inside that barn reached by a corridor dug underground, the difference between total loss and survival was being decided. Not by luck, not by miracle, but by meticulous preparation that everyone had ridiculed months before. The hours passed slowly. The storm raged outside, relentless, but within the system created by the tunnel, there was order, there was function, there was tangible hope. People worked in silence, focused, aware that every movement mattered. There was no longer room for wounded pride or shame for having doubted. There was only the immediate task of keeping alive the beings that depended on them, and with each trip completed through the tunnel, with each bucket of feed delivered, with each animal that continued to breathe, the certainty solidified. That narrow, improvised corridor was the only reason why there was still a possible future when the storm finally passed. Moments like this make us understand that preparation isn't an exaggeration, it's wisdom. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be shared. The storm lasted 3 more days before finally receding. When the wind stopped and the sky cleared, The silence was almost unsettling after so much noise. Snow covered everything in a uniform layer that reached chest height in some places, transforming the landscape into something unrecognizable. But the losses, which could have been devastating, were contained. The animals that depended on access through the tunnel survived. The families who used the corridor kept their herds intact. Other properties were not so lucky. Stories circulated about abandoned barns, piled up dead animals, plans to sell everything and leave as soon as the roads were clear. The difference between those who had prepared and those who had relied solely on tradition was etched on every property in the region, visible like an open scar. In the following weeks, while winter still held sway but with less fury, the change took hold. No one looked at her with condescension or doubt anymore. When she went to town, now occasionally accompanied by neighbors who sought advice on structural adaptations, the conversations were different. Practical, direct, devoid of irony. Older farmers, who had previously ignored her, now asked questions about ideal depth, types of reinforcement, ventilation systems. Some even started their own excavations, adapting the idea to their specific needs. The tunnel had ceased to be the eccentricity of an inexperienced young woman and had become a technical benchmark. And she, without seeking recognition or validation, had become someone whose word carried weight, whose competence was indisputable. The property at the end of the back road hadn't changed much on the outside. The house remained small and dark, the barn still solid and functional. But something fundamental had shifted. There was no more involuntary isolation, only the conscious choice to keep her distance when necessary. People came to her now, not to judge, but to learn. And when the next winter approached, she knew she wouldn't be alone in preparing anymore. The tunnel's legacy wasn't just the physical structure dug beneath the frozen earth. It was silent proof that anticipating the improbable is wiser than blindly trusting what has always worked before. Because the world changes, and those who don't change with it don't survive. Stories of those who prepared when everyone doubted them deserve to be remembered. If you've made it this far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this.